this morning comes from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Listen now for the word of the Lord. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." This is the word of the Lord. When I was 12, my mother took me to the big city, Indianapolis, Indiana. We were there to watch a slate of college basketball games, part of the annual March Madness tournament. Seemed pretty exciting at the time, but I don't remember much about the trip. I don't remember the games or the skyline or the hot dogs at the arena. I just remember the face of the homeless man we passed on our way back to the car. I remember the dirt on his face and the grease in his curly blonde hair. I remember the way he asked for a little spare change, quietly and gently and without expectation. I remember feeling the weight of the money in my pocket, money I had been given to spend on popcorn or programs or whatever else a kid might buy at a basketball game. I remember how that money felt heavier and heavier with each step I took as we walked further and further away. I'm not entirely certain why I didn't stop. Maybe I was afraid of the man. Maybe I was afraid of being left behind. For whatever reason, I kept walking. But I couldn't help feeling the divide between all the money we had spent to drive to Indianapolis and buy tickets and buy overpriced food and sit in comfort, the divide between that extravagance, that luxury, and this man's simple request for a little spare change. In college, I had the opportunity to spend a semester in Europe. I went to major cities all around the continent, like London and Paris and Barcelona. It was another extravagance, a much bigger luxury. And I was grateful for the opportunity to soak in all that history and culture and atmosphere. But I was also confronted again and again with homelessness. You see, I come from a town about the size of St. Joe, and we have homelessness there, but it's not as visible as it was in those big cities. You can't see it as easily. It's not stretched out in the alleyways. It doesn't have a skinny dog following it from trash can to trash can. It doesn't wear raggedy shoes with worn soles. You just don't see it as well. Again and again, I had to decide what I would do when someone asked for money. Would I give away what I had in my pocket? Would I ignore them, pretending I hadn't heard? Would I offer to walk somewhere with them to buy them food? Wouldn't that be more expensive than just giving spare change? What if I gave away too much and ran out of money? What if I gave and all they did was spend the money on drugs and alcohol? What if they aren't really homeless, but con artists looking for a quick buck? I tried giving to some and ignoring others, but that felt unfair. Who was I to decide who was worthy of help and who wasn't? So I started ignoring everyone. The people on the street kind of scared me. And some of them were probably alcoholics or drug addicts, I thought. And the rest of them were probably con artists, playing on the sympathy of tourists like me. But I kept thinking about a line from a song. And the least of these look like criminals to me, so I leave Christ on the street. That line played like a loop in my head every time I walked past someone and pretended I hadn't heard or hadn't seen. Every time I assumed that some other human being made in the image of God was just a con artist, or just a drug addict, or just a scary-looking dude. And the least of these look like criminals to me, so I leave Christ on the street. I started to realize that the decision to give or not to give was not about them. It was about me. They could do whatever they wanted with the money. The people on the street are human beings, and what they choose to do with the gifts they are given is their responsibility. My responsibility is to figure out whether I will give or not. To figure out whether I want to be the kind of person who clings tightly to what he has, or whether I want to be the kind of person who gives freely. Whether I want to be the kind of person who lives in a world of scarcity, afraid of running out and being left behind, or the kind of person who lives in a world of abundance, where gifts are freely given and freely received. I chose the second one. I chose to see the least of these not as criminals, but as Christ. And I chose to do a small bit of something to help them get along with their day. In our reading this morning, Jesus tells a story about a man in need. He was robbed and beaten on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jesus doesn't tell us much about the man. We don't know why he was traveling or what he did for a living or whether he did anything to somehow invite or deserve the beating. The only thing we know is that he is a man in need, and that's the only thing we need to know. In the midst of the man's suffering, 3 people approach him. One of them is a pastor who sees the man in pain, lying on the side of the road, naked, beaten half to death. She sees that he is in trouble, so she refers him to InterServe, telling him about all the services they offer there, and letting him know that if he can find a way to get to Calvin Center or Wesley Center, they can help him with bus passes and first aid and a little food. The pastor thinks about taking the man there herself, but then she realizes if you give these people handouts for everything, they just become dependent. He has to take the first step for himself. And so, good deed done for the day, the pastor keeps walking down that road. The second person who comes by is a deacon. He's a pious, religious man. He loves helping out in his church. He sits in the front pew every Sunday morning and faithfully attends Bible study every Monday night. When he sees the man in need, naked and beaten half to death, lying on the side of the road, he is moved with compassion. He goes to the man and prays for him. He offers up a beautiful prayer. Then, with his good deed done for the day, the deacon keeps walking down that road. Finally, a man approaches who doesn't even go to church. A man with blue hair and a leather jacket, plastered with tattoos from head to foot. When he sees the man in need, he wraps him up in his leather jacket, puts him in the sidecar of his motorcycle, and drives him to the hospital. He makes sure that the doctors and the nurses treat his wounds and admit him to a room. He tells them that he doesn't know anything about the man. The man's wallet and all his clothes were taken by whoever beat him up, but that if he doesn't have insurance, he'll pay for the man's medical bills. The staff at the hospital thank him for being a good Samaritan. He says farewell to the man in need, and lets him know that he'll be back in a couple of days to check in on him. Jesus tells this story during a mission conference he was invited to lead for a local church. The elders knew that they were called to love their neighbors as themselves, but they wanted to know who their neighbors were, how Jesus defined the word neighbor. He told this story and then asked the elders, of these three, the pastor, the deacon, and the man on the motorcycle, which of them was a neighbor to the man in need? They were surprised by the question. They had wanted Jesus to define the boundaries of their neighborhood, to tell them that they should be most concerned about the people in their church, or in their community, or in their state, or in their country. But Jesus' story didn't allow for any boundaries between the people in the church and their neighbors. Everyone in need was their neighbor. Rather than defining the borders of their neighborhood, Jesus challenged them to be a neighbor to anyone and everyone in need. During the rest of the mission conference, the members of the church explored their dreams and visions, trying to figure out how to apply the lessons of the story to the mission and ministry of the congregation. Some people said that the story meant they should give absolutely everything they could to anyone who made a request with no exceptions. They argued that we shouldn't ask questions about whether people are really in need or how they will use the money, and we shouldn't worry about running out of money. We should simply give, and God will provide. But other people wondered if that was really the lesson of the story. They pointed out that the man on the motorcycle didn't try to help everyone in the world who had a need. He helped out where he could. And even then, he didn't let himself get totally overwhelmed by the man's needs. He didn't lose sight of himself while taking care of the man. He had his own reasons for being on the road that day. And once he knew that the man was being taken care of in the hospital, he went back on the road and kept driving. Other members chimed in, remembering that the man on the motorcycle hadn't tried to do everything himself. He relied on the doctors and the nurses to do their part. He was one part of a larger team addressing the man's needs. All of a sudden, the whole thing became less overwhelming. They knew they couldn't help absolutely everyone in the world who had a need. They knew they probably couldn't even help everyone who knocked on the door or left a message on the answering machine. But they also knew they could do a lot more than they had ever done before. So they started turning their dreams into plans. They decided to convert an underused portion of their parking lot into a skate park for local kids, so that they could have a safe place to ride their skateboards. They decided to partner with another local church that was providing meals for the hungry, to look for ways to share in some of the expense and labor of cooking and serving. They knew a number of folks in the congregation had skills in home repair, so they looked for ways to connect their expertise with people in need. And they didn't want to neglect the wider world, so they looked for a sister congregation in a developing country that they could partner with. They would provide money and other resources, and the other church would provide local know-how and feet on the ground to help build God's kingdom in that place. In everything they planned, they remembered the lessons of the story. They remembered that it wasn't about the people requesting help, about their worthiness or whether they really needed help or what they would do with what the church gave them. But it was about them. It was about whether they would decide, as individuals and as a congregation, to be neighbors to as many people as they could. It was about whether they were willing to step up. As they began to live into their new sense of mission, they came to see how important it was to treat the people they served with dignity and respect. They had always known that they were called to love their neighbors as themselves, but they began to realize that that meant treating people in need like equals. It meant not referring to people in need as them or those people, but as individuals with names and stories. It meant partnering with people in need and letting them decide how they can best be served, rather than deciding how we would like to serve and imposing our will on them. One of the things they learned is that people in need get tired of answering invasive questions, tired of justifying themselves and their requests to every agency and every church and every government office that dangles the promise of help in exchange for a good story. So they stopped asking people to justify themselves, and they simply offered help whenever and wherever they could. One of the elders said, "I would rather take the risk of giving something to someone who doesn't need it than take the risk of letting someone walk away who needs support." All of this was a major change for the congregation. They knew it wouldn't be easy. They knew it would involve taking some time and taking a risk. But they also knew they had a responsibility to be good neighbors to everyone in need. Amen.